Why the Soviets didn't release German POWs post-World War II. On a freezing January morning in 1956, 11 years after World War II had ended, a train pulled into a station in West Germany. The platform was crowded with families holding photographs, some yellowed and creased from years of handling. They were waiting, hoping, praying. When the train doors opened, skeletal figures in tattered uniforms stepped out, blinking in the winter light like men emerging from a tomb. These were the last German prisoners of war returning from the Soviet Union, and their stories would reveal one of the most brutal chapters in post-war history. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. These men were the lucky ones. They were coming home. Hundreds of thousands of others never would. The question isn't just why the Soviets kept these prisoners for over a decade after the war ended. The real question is why they needed them so desperately, what they did to them, and how this massive system of forced labor became one of Stalin's most closely guarded secrets. What you're about to hear goes far beyond simple revenge. This is a story about the true cost of total war, about how victory can taste like ashes, and about the millions of men who became ghosts, erased from history while their families waited by empty windows. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Soviet Union held approximately 3 million German soldiers in captivity. 3 million. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of Chicago. But unlike American or British POW camps, where most German soldiers would be home within a year or two, Soviet captivity was different. It was a descent into a parallel world where the war never really ended, where peace was just another word, and where survival became a full-time occupation. Let's start with what most people don't understand about the Eastern Front. This wasn't warfare as the Western Allies experienced it. This was something far more primal, far more vicious. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Hitler had made it clear this would be a war of annihilation. The infamous Commissar Order decreed that Soviet political officers were to be shot on sight. The hunger plan deliberately aimed to starve millions of Soviet citizens to feed German troops. Entire villages were burned. The siege of Leningrad alone killed over 1 million civilians through starvation and bombardment. By the time the war ended, the Soviet Union had lost approximately 27 million people, both military and civilian. 27 million. That's more than the combined losses of Britain, France, and the United States multiplied by 10. So when Soviet forces began capturing German soldiers, they weren't just taking prisoners. They were capturing the architects of their national trauma. Every German soldier represented the face of the enemy that had destroyed their cities, killed their families, and left their country in ruins. The desire for revenge was almost gravitational in its pull. But Stalin, brilliant and ruthless as always, saw something else in these 3 million men. He saw a resource. The Soviet Union in 1945 was victorious but devastated. Entire industrial regions had been destroyed. 70,000 villages had been razed. Thousands of factories were rubble. The infrastructure that had taken decades to build was gone. And here's the cruel mathematics that Stalin understood perfectly. Rebuilding would require millions of workers, and the Soviet Union had just lost millions of working-age men to the war. The German POWs weren't just prisoners. They were a labor force that had literally delivered itself to Soviet doorsteps. Now, international law was clear on this. The Geneva Convention stated that prisoners of war should be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of hostilities. The Soviet Union had signed the Hague Convention, which had similar provisions. But Stalin had a remarkable talent for ignoring international agreements when they didn't serve his purposes. And besides, the Soviets argued, Germany had treated Soviet POWs with unspeakable brutality. Of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, nearly 3.3 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, execution, or forced labor. That's a death rate of nearly 60%. So when Western diplomats pressed Stalin on releasing German prisoners, his response was essentially, "They'll go home when we're finished with them." The camps where these men were held weren't concentration camps in the Nazi sense, but they were far from humane. The GUPVI, the main administration for affairs of prisoners of war and internees, operated hundreds of camps across the Soviet Union. These camps stretched from Ukraine to Siberia, from the Caucasus to the Arctic Circle. German soldiers who had fought in the relative warmth of France suddenly found themselves in labor camps beyond the Ural Mountains, where winter temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero. They worked in coal mines, in lumber camps, in construction brigades. They rebuilt factories they had destroyed during the war. They constructed apartment blocks in Stalingrad, the very city they had tried to capture. The conditions were brutal by design and necessity. The Soviet Union itself was struggling to feed its own population. In the winter of 1946 to 47, a severe famine struck the Soviet Union, killing perhaps 1 million Soviet citizens. In that context, German POWs were low on the priority list for food allocation. Daily rations could drop to as low as 400 calories, sometimes less. To understand what that means, an average adult man needs about 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day just to maintain basic functions. At 400 calories, your body begins to consume itself. Men became walking skeletons. Their teeth fell out from scurvy. Dysentery was rampant. Tuberculosis spread through the camps like wildfire. And yet they were expected to work. Coal mines demanded quotas. Construction brigades had targets. If you didn't meet your quota, your rations were cut further. It was a death spiral. The weaker you became, the less you could work. The less you could work, the less you ate. The less you ate, the weaker you became. Thousands died this way, their bodies simply giving out under the accumulated weight of malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. They were buried in unmarked graves across the Soviet Union, their families back in Germany receiving no notification, no closure, just an eternal, gnawing absence. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't know. Stalin didn't keep all German POWs for the same reason. There were different categories, different fates. The ordinary soldiers, the rank and file, they were the labor force. But there was another group, a special category. Specialists, engineers, scientists, technicians. These men had knowledge that Stalin coveted. The Soviet atomic bomb project, for instance, relied partly on German scientists and technicians who were kept in special camps with better conditions in exchange for their expertise. Some German engineers worked on Soviet rocket programs. Others helped rebuild Soviet industrial capacity by sharing technical knowledge that Soviet industry lacked. And then there was the darkest category, those accused of war crimes. The Soviet Union conducted thousands of investigations into German POWs suspected of participating in atrocities. Some of these investigations were legitimate. The Eastern Front had been characterized by horrific war crimes on both sides, and many German units had participated in mass killings, village burnings, and other atrocities. But the investigations were also used as tools of control. The threat of being classified as a war criminal, which could mean execution or a 25-year sentence in the Gulag, hung over every prisoner's head. Confessions were extracted under duress. Innocent men were sometimes convicted because the Soviet system needed scapegoats, or because someone had to meet a quota of convictions, or simply because Soviet justice in the Stalin era was arbitrary and cruel. As the years dragged on, something extraordinary happened in Germany. The absence of these men became a political issue. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, West Germany was rebuilding rapidly under the Marshall Plan. The government of Konrad Adenauer was establishing itself as a reliable Western ally. But there was an open wound: the missing prisoners. Families didn't know if their fathers, sons, and brothers were alive or dead. The Soviets released some prisoners in waves, usually the sick and disabled first, which was its own form of cruelty. Imagine waiting years for your husband to return, only to find him broken in body and spirit, a shadow of the man who left. The West German government began keeping meticulous records, trying to account for every missing soldier. They established the German Red Cross Search Service, which received millions of inquiries from families. The political pressure on Adenauer was immense. How could West Germany move forward when hundreds of thousands of its men were still in Soviet captivity? The issue became tied up in Cold War politics. The Soviets used the prisoners as leverage, releasing them in small groups when they wanted concessions or better relations with West Germany. By the early 1950s, Stalin was still alive, and there was no hope of mass releases. But then, in March 1953, Stalin died. His death changed everything, slowly at first, then accelerating. Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new Soviet leader, and he saw things differently than Stalin. Khrushchev was brutal in his own ways, but he was also more pragmatic. He understood that holding German POWs a decade after the war served little purpose and generated enormous international criticism. The labor they provided was decreasingly valuable as the Soviet economy recovered, and there was a more immediate concern. Khrushchev wanted to improve relations with West Germany. In 1955, Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow. This was an extraordinary moment. The West German chancellor, representing a country that less than a decade earlier had tried to destroy the Soviet Union, was now negotiating directly with Soviet leadership. Adenauer made the return of German POWs his central demand. Khrushchev agreed, but with conditions. West Germany would establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. The prisoners would be released, but Soviet records would be the final word on who was alive and who was dead. No independent verification would be allowed. And so, in late 1955 and early 1956, the final releases began. Trains departed from camps across the Soviet Union, carrying men who had been imprisoned for over a decade. When they arrived in Germany, the scenes were overwhelming. Families who had maintained hope for years finally received confirmation. But for many others, the returning prisoners brought devastating news. Your son died in 1947. Your husband never survived the first winter. Your brother was executed for alleged war crimes in 1948. The final accounting was brutal. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, roughly 1 million died in captivity. 1 in 3 never came home. But even these numbers tell only part of the story. The men who did return carried scars that never healed. They had spent the years between ages 25 and 35, or 30 and 40, prime years of life in Soviet camps. They returned to a country that had moved on, to families that had adapted to their absence, to a world that didn't know what to do with them. Many suffered from what we would now call PTSD. They had nightmares about the camps. They couldn't speak about what they had endured. Some struggled with survivor's guilt, haunted by the friends and comrades they had left behind in unmarked graves across the Soviet Union. The psychological impact extended beyond the individuals. An entire generation of German children grew up without fathers. Women raised families alone, not knowing whether they were widows or wives in waiting. The social fabric of post-war Germany bore these invisible wounds. And here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of this period. The Soviet Union's treatment of German POWs created a reservoir of anti-communist sentiment in West Germany that persisted for decades. Every family that lost someone to Soviet camps, every community that waited years for their men to return, remembered. This was the human cost of Soviet policy, measured not just in lives lost, but in generational trauma and political alienation. Now, the Soviet Union's official position throughout this period was that they were simply applying reciprocal treatment. German camps had killed millions of Soviet POWs, so German prisoners could expect no better. But this logic, while emotionally understandable, violated the fundamental principles that were supposed to govern post-war conduct. The Geneva Conventions existed precisely to prevent cycles of retribution. The whole point of international humanitarian law was to say, even in war, even after terrible crimes, there are lines we don't cross. The Soviet Union crossed those lines repeatedly and deliberately. But we also need to understand the context that made this possible. The scale of Soviet suffering during World War II was so immense that it defies easy comprehension. Every Soviet family had lost someone. Every community had been touched by death. The scars weren't just physical, but civilizational. Cities like Stalingrad had been reduced to ruins where dogs and rats fought over corpses. The collective trauma of the Soviet people was nearly bottomless. In that context, showing mercy to German soldiers wasn't just difficult, it felt like betraying the memory of the millions who had died. The Soviet public, to the extent they knew about the German POWs, generally supported their continued detention. Stalin understood this perfectly. He was many things, but politically tone-deaf wasn't one of them. He knew that releasing German prisoners in 1945 or 1946 would have been deeply unpopular with his own people. Better to put them to work rebuilding what they had destroyed. Better to make them pay in sweat and blood for the devastation they had brought to Soviet soil. The fact that many of these individual soldiers hadn't personally committed atrocities, that many had been conscripts with no say in Hitler's invasion, didn't matter. Collective guilt was easier to administer than individual justice. This raises uncomfortable questions about victimhood and accountability. The German soldiers held in Soviet camps were, in one sense, victims of a brutal detention system, but they were also members of an armed force that had invaded the Soviet Union with the explicit intention of subjugating, enslaving, and in many cases, killing the Soviet population. How do we balance these realities? The answer isn't simple, and perhaps that's the point. The aftermath of World War II was full of these moral complexities, situations where everyone had legitimate grievances and there were no clean solutions. What makes the story of German POWs in the Soviet Union particularly poignant is that it was happening while the world was supposedly at peace. The Nuremberg trials were establishing principles of international justice. The United Nations was being created to prevent future conflicts. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted. And in the background, hundreds of thousands of men were dying in camps, their fate hidden behind Soviet secrecy. The International Committee of the Red Cross tried repeatedly to gain access to the camps and was repeatedly denied. Western governments protested but couldn't do much beyond words. The Cold War was beginning, and nobody wanted to push too hard on issues that might escalate tensions. The German POW issue also became tangled up in the broader question of Soviet captivity. There were Japanese POWs in Soviet camps too, held for years after Japan's surrender. There were Eastern European political prisoners. The entire Gulag system held millions of Soviet citizens convicted of political crimes or simply caught in Stalin's paranoid purges. In a sense, the German POWs were just one thread in a vast tapestry of Soviet imprisonment. The system that held them was the same system that held Soviet dissidents, Ukrainian nationalists, Baltic independence fighters, and millions of others deemed enemies of the state. When Khrushchev finally released the last German prisoners in 1955 to 56, it wasn't just mercy. It was pragmatic politics. The Soviet Union wanted West Germany to remain neutral in the Cold War, or at least to be less enthusiastically pro-American. Holding POWs a decade after the war wasn't achieving anything useful. The labor they provided was marginal compared to the diplomatic cost. Better to release them, score some goodwill, and move on. Khrushchev even met with some of the released prisoners, shaking their hands for cameras, a gesture that would have been unthinkable under Stalin. But the damage was done. The deaths of 1 million men couldn't be undone. The years stolen from survivors couldn't be returned. The families destroyed couldn't be made whole. And in a broader sense, the Soviet treatment of German POWs became part of the historical record that would later be used to judge the Soviet system itself. When people asked whether the Soviet Union was fundamentally different from Nazi Germany, or just another totalitarian state wearing a different ideology, the treatment of prisoners was part of the answer. In the decades since, historians have worked to document what happened in these camps. German researchers have compiled databases trying to account for every missing soldier. Russian archives, partially opened after the fall of the Soviet Union, have revealed some of the bureaucratic machinery behind the camp system. We now know more than we did. But gaps remain. Some camps were so remote that proper records were never kept. Some prisoners died and were buried without any documentation. Their families, even today, don't know what happened to them. The story of German POWs in Soviet captivity is ultimately a story about the aftermath of total war. When entire societies throw themselves into conflict with no quarter given, when the goal is not just military victory, but the complete destruction of the enemy, the resulting hatred doesn't evaporate with a peace treaty. It lingers, it festers, it expresses itself in ways that violate every principle of human dignity and international law. The German soldiers held in Soviet camps were part of this cycle. They had participated in an invasion that brought unspeakable suffering to the Soviet people. The Soviet state responded by inflicting suffering in return, creating new victims, new grievances, new traumas that would echo through generations. There's a bitter irony in all this. The Soviet Union held these prisoners partly for reconstruction, to rebuild what war had destroyed. But the human cost of that rebuilding was so high, the moral compromises so severe, that it undermined the very victory they had won. How do you celebrate liberation when you're holding millions in camps? How do you claim moral superiority over Nazi Germany when you're starving prisoners to death? The Soviets never fully resolved these contradictions. They simply moved forward, as societies often do after terrible events, carrying the weight of the past but not always acknowledging it. For the men who survived Soviet captivity and returned to Germany, life was never quite normal. They had lost a decade. They had seen friends die of hunger and disease. They had worked until their bodies broke. They carried memories that couldn't be shared with people who hadn't been there. Many found that their marriages had dissolved, that their children didn't recognize them, that the world had moved on without them. They were ghosts who had come back to life, but the world they returned to wasn't the one they had left. And yet, many of them persevered. They rebuilt their lives. They had families. They worked. They contributed to West Germany's economic miracle. But always, in quiet moments, they remembered. They remembered the cold of Siberian winters. They remembered the hunger that never quite went away. They remembered the friends buried in foreign soil. These memories, transmitted through families and communities, became part of West Germany's collective understanding of the war and its aftermath. They reinforced the determination that such a war must never happen again. The Soviet Union's decision to hold German POWs for years after World War II ended reveals something fundamental about how nations process trauma. The easy answer is revenge. The hard answer is justice. The Soviet choice was somewhere in between, neither fully one nor the other, satisfying no one but perhaps inevitable given the scale of suffering the war had produced. It stands as a reminder that winning a war doesn't solve the problems that caused it. Victory brings its own challenges, its own moral dilemmas, its own costs that must be paid in human lives and dignity. Today, the camps are mostly gone. Some have been preserved as historical sites. Others have simply disappeared, reclaimed by the forests and steppes where they once stood. But the story endures. It endures in the families still searching for information about missing relatives. It endures in the historical record, meticulously documented by researchers. And it endures as a warning about what happens when nations embrace total war and the hatreds it generates. The men who stepped off those trains in 1956 were the last witnesses to a chapter of history that nobody wanted to remember, but nobody could afford to forget. Their suffering, and the suffering of those who never came home, stands as testimony to a simple truth. In war, everyone loses something, and some lose everything.